So welcome to the third in our four-part series on how to design and deliver a shiur at WebYeshiva.org. My name is Rabbi Johnny Solomon. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Web Yeshiva. I'm also the virtual rabbi. And through the Web Yeshiva website, you can book online spiritual coaching and halakhic consultations with me. But the purpose of this shiur is to continue our exploration and talk about the skills and the tools necessary to design and deliver a shiur. Do you remember in our first session, we talked about the difference between a nice vort and a mini shiur and a full-size, meal-like shiur. And that third category is what we're focusing on here. And what we're going to do is jump straight in. I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to review where we are in our series of topics and move forward. So we already talked about what is a shiur and choosing a topic. I hope you can see the screen. Is that visible to you all? Wonderful. And then we spoke about researching a topic and recommended resources. Today we're going to discuss preparing a source sheet, titles, bios, translations, and vowelization. Obviously, there may be other issues that arise, but that's our primary focus. And oftentimes people assume that a shiur needs to be accompanied by a shiur source sheet. Now, let's be perfectly clear. In principle, I'm really delivering a workshop here. But I could be delivering a shiur, and instead of doing a source sheet in the classic sense of the word, I would be using a PowerPoint like I'm using now. And in fact, there's a lot of good arguments to say that the classic A4 page of lots of sources in Hebrew is not the best way to deliver material. And especially if you're delivering a shiur online, using the tools of presentation, such as, but not limited to PowerPoint, is a wonderful way to present many sources and give them the kind of platform they deserve, one source per slide, and moving forward. However, many times that's not the situation. You're giving a shiur in person, and for practical reasons, people want a page or a couple of pages to walk away with. And accordingly, source sheets enable that. And I think there are skills in terms of constructing more helpful source sheets and less helpful source sheets. So in the spirit of, if you're going to prepare a page or two or three with Jewish sources to help the learners who are attending your shiur follow the shiur you're delivering, the question then is, what should that look like? Or what are good features you could incorporate in a source sheet? And what are things to look out for? So before I start talking, I'd love to hear from you, both in terms of your own experiences as teachers, as learners, any particular thoughts. Just to remind you, I can't always see anybody's hand up. So feel free to unmute yourself. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yes, Yehuda. So you need to unmute yourself, sir.
That's a mute point. Since COVID, prior to COVID, I had real-time shiurim and moved everything to online. And using PowerPoint was just a game changer. Opened up all kinds of possibilities. I had the opportunity sometimes to include graphics or maps, which also help along. I wanted to suggest you can combine PowerPoint and handout. Some of my participants want handouts, and you can save PowerPoint off as a PDF that cannot be edited and share it with the audience like a handout.
100%. And both for this class and for many others, when I do especially online classes, I send the PDF version of my PowerPoint. And by the way, I do that for actually a very particular and technical reason. Different computers have different Hebrew fonts. So if I make a PowerPoint with certain Hebrew fonts and somebody else opens it up as a PowerPoint, it's quite possible that what they'll see is different to what I'd presented because they don't have the font I have, and it will look different. Now you may well say, who cares? Well, if the format matters, then that will be a key difference. So saving it as a PDF means they get to see the way I wanted it to be seen. So transferring things into PDF, if you're sharing things, both if it's a PowerPoint or Word document or whatever other platform you're using, is always a good tip if you want people to receive something as you presented it. Still, as I said, while there are many different ways to present material, what I'm going to focus on in this session is, shall we say, the classic source sheet, not because I think we should be limited to that, and I'm strongly an advocate for other ways of presenting ideas and sources, but because for various reasons, practical reasons, photocopying reasons, for various reasons, Shabbat reasons, technology reasons, it often works out that when one's giving a shiur, it is accompanied by a piece of paper rather than necessarily a screen, and ideally a piece of paper of limited numbers of pieces of paper, because perhaps we may be printing these things at home and there is a limitation of the resources. I apologize, by the way, who's just put their hand up? A. Gruner. So, A. Gruner, remind me of your first name. Apologies for that.
It's Frank, actually. A is
That's right.
Frank.
Apologies.
Sorry.
Thank you. Okay, yes.
Yes, I just want to mention a couple of things. When you're putting things online, it's always important to remember to keep them in a format that disabled people can read with their screen readers.
Yes,
I,
absolutely.
and the other thing that one can do too when you're putting it in a format where people can print it out is you can leave a space always where they can take notes, and that way can make it interactive at the time. And they're much more like people are much more likely to remember when they're actively doing when they're actively physically taking notes.
Mm.
With an
I
actual
agree with that. I actually used to leave a box at the bottom of every page. I don't always do that now, but I do agree that many people appreciate that, or at least leave broad margins. If you leave very narrow margins, that doesn't provide for that opportunity. If you leave broad margins, then people can write in the margins and there is a meaningful amount of space, and also leave spaces between sources so that room can be found between one source and another. Again, these things may be small, but every single one of these things improves the experience of somebody who's coming to a class that you're delivering, who is receiving the thing you're giving them, and they want to learn from you. So helping them do so and helping them maintain a record of the class is just basically benefiting you and benefiting them. Sorry, please, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that you can indicate that you can also indicate at the bottom of the page to be sure to use the verso of the page, the back blank page, also as note taking room, and people can also do that. It's very helpful.
I agree, and I appreciate that. And people who are jotting these things down, you should. I've listed some pro tips. Some of those I should have written down, and now we can jot those down ourselves. So let's talk a little bit now about what might be on a source sheet. And by the way, this also applies to other formats of presenting sources to accompany a shiur. There really are two approaches to the number of sources on a source sheet. We can always say don't do too many. That's not a helpful phrase, although there is truth in the idea of don't do too many. But I'd say there's two approaches to the number of sources one presents on a daf makorot, on a source sheet. Option A is you're presenting just the headlines, meaning the collection of the major sources and references that you're going to mention on your shiur. Option B is everything. Every single thing you wish to mention, which may well be sourced somewhere, you're going to put on your source sheet. Now, to be clear, there are pros and cons of both of these. Many people appreciate the headlines approach, and many people appreciate the everything approach. And oftentimes it's simply a question of, if I gave you everything, the handout would be 6-7 pages, and that becomes nigh impossible. And so instead, I'm going to give you the headlines. But this itself forces a teacher to say, which of the sources I'm referencing in my shiur are the ikar and which are the tafel, meaning which are the core things I'm referencing and which are just interesting things I intend to make reference of, but really aren't the focus of the analysis, right? Aren't the focus of the question and the answer, as mentioned before. So think about, am I doing a headline source sheet or an everything source sheet? I would generally encourage towards the headlines approach, although I don't see anything wrong with the everything approach within reason. But know that obviously sometimes, as they say in the Talmud, tafasta murbe lo tafasta. You add too much, you actually detract from what you're putting together. So before we go on, any thoughts about these two approaches? You've probably been to a shiur of a headlines type of source sheet. And you've probably been to a shiur with an everything type of source sheet.
I would say it's possible to combine the two, where you give the headline source sheet during the shiur, and then you can present your everything source sheet as the resources given after the shiur as a further link for more information. And that way people aren't just here, and yet they get all the information later.
That's very, very helpful. And I think that's a good tip. Anybody else with thoughts just on this differential between headlines and everything? Yehuda.
One exception to both of these, or a third choice, is sometimes I want the standard page layout. If somebody's doing a Gemara share, I want them to see the Tzura Sadaf of the Vilna edition. They should be familiarized with it. And that'll probably speak to adding Nikudot.
Right, so we're going to get to that point soon, and that's a really important one, which I think unfortunately is being overlooked more and more as we have more and more digitized text. So this is going to be another major focus of our session today, where we're going to contrast two approaches to the format of texts that we present in a shiur. Any further thoughts just about, in terms, here we're talking about quantity, not necessarily format. Just think back about the kind of source sheets you may have. If you had a headline source sheet that somebody gave you, was it good enough to enable you to review the shiur afterwards? If it was an everything source sheet, was it good enough to enable you to review? By the way, the answer is, well, it depends on a whole variety of further factors. For example, if they have a whole bunch of sources, but in a language I don't understand, doesn't matter. They could have 5 million sources. That's useless to me. So what is the goal of handouts? With this in mind, I'd like to suggest the following. The goal of preparing source sheets, why we prepare source sheets, is to enable your learners to follow the flow of your shiur, to empower your learners with access to the main sources referenced in your shiur, and to gift your learners a record of the main sources referenced in your shiur. Enable, empower, gift. This is, to my mind, why we prepare source sheets. Enable the experience of following the flow of the shiur in the shiur. Empower students in terms of access to these sources both during the shiur and afterwards, and gifting them something to take away, to have a record that I went to this class and I learned these things, and I have that piece of paper or these pieces of paper or whatever else it could be, this PDF on my computer as a record of it. Anybody got any comments about those three elements in terms of why we prepare source sheets: enable, empower, and gift? Okay. Well, I want to just focus a little bit more on what we do with those words, because with those words, the ideal source sheet should enable and empower someone who attended your shiur to review the shiur on the basis of the source sheet you have gifted them, and if they so wish, deliver the main teachings and ideas of your shiur to someone who did not attend your shiur. Again, I'm not trying to discover America here. I'm being deliberately simplistic in many ways about what the goals of a source sheet are and the ideal source sheet, because I think too often we forget this. If I go to a shiur and you bother to make me a handout, And it doesn't enable me to follow the flow of your shiur. And it doesn't empower me to give access to the main things you're referencing, because you gave me so few sources, and most of shiur was about something else that's not mentioned. And when I leave, I kind of don't know what to do with it, because it's in a language I can't access. In fact, I'm not even so sure where these sources are, because you didn't give me clear references. Then almost what's the point? I wouldn't say what's the point, but almost what's the point? The flip side, I've gone to shiurim, and the teaching was so clear and the source sheet was so clear that enabled me to basically reshare the shiur afterwards, not the totality, not all the details. Sometimes my wife has come back from a shiur, she said, it was a great shiur, you'd have loved it. I say, well, why would I have loved it? And she says, here's this handout, and then she'll give me a short précis about what was taught. What she says in 3 minutes is not the totality of a shiur of an hour. But with the handout and what she says, I say, okay, I kind of get it. Thank you. And then I'm obviously able to follow up with the teacher if something makes me curious, if I would like to know more about that idea, that teaching, that source, that concept, because I wasn't there. Any thoughts about what I've just said in the past 2 slides?
Yes. I would just say that if there's time, it's always good to take your source sheets and try them on somebody who hasn't heard the shiur. Give them to them and see what they come away with, and ask them for feedback. Say, what did you just learn from this? And that way you'll have an idea what your source sheets are. And try, and if you have more time, you can try with people of different levels of learning, different backgrounds.
Okay, so I think that's to ask a lot of the source sheet producer if the person hasn't been to the shiur. See, I believe it's a tool to enable the one who has been to help somebody who hasn't. Because ultimately the source sheet is only a handful of sources, which is a skeleton of a shiur which may well have touched on other things. I do hear you, meaning that a source sheet has to have a certain framework integrity. It has to indicate a certain flow, a kind of a direction of both the kind of sources being quoted, the kind of ideas being quoted. You have to have a taste, a tima. A source sheet should at least give me an idea of whether this was a shiur or machshava or halacha. What kind of shiur was it? If I look at the source sheet and I say I have no idea what kind of talk this was, let alone what their focus is, there's something missing. It means it's ambiguous, right? So it's meant to prompt the person who's been at the shiur to remember what they learnt in the shiur and then to pass on. You know, Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, he says, actually the Torah is like a source sheet. He kind of says it's like lecture notes, but it's like a source sheet for somebody who was at the lecture of God teaching Moshe teaching the Jewish people the Torah at Mount Sinai. The Torah doesn't tell us all the details. Obviously, we have a Torah Shabbat Peh for that. But the Torah is supposed to be enough for us to have sensed both what was written and what was said. And so too with a source sheet, so too with a handout. Any further thoughts just on these words, enable, empower, and gift? I think they're really important words. Okay. Let us now talk about that tricky issue that you had mentioned, and I'd like to discuss it in great depth, which is the 2 approaches to the format of sources on source sheets. Now, this is a modern problem. You know, I remember I remember my first experience of using the Bar Ilan database on a computer in university and saying, oh my gosh, these things in books are now available as digitized text. Wow. Like you had to have some kind of special code to access what was a first version or whatever. And then I remember the discs, this CD-ROMs that you would be able to buy with the Tanakh and the Talmud. And it's like, wow, I can have all of these things on one of these small discs. Do you remember we thought like a disc was tiny? Wow. And now, I mean, the amount of text available, mostly for free on an amazing site like Sefaria, Ala Torah, etc., is remarkable. It truly is fabulous. And I use all the different digital databases for lots of different reasons almost every day. There are also other databases with scanned books, Hebrew books, Otzar Chochmah, and a few others as well, where the format of the book is there for you to download or for you to screenshot or whatever, however you use those particular websites. And then, of course, I sit in a room full of books, and many of you do as well. You know, most of this wisdom are actually found in physical books. The fact that we even use computers is a relatively modern phenomenon. So then it comes to this interesting question. Two approaches to the format of sources on source sheets. Should we, where possible, present the texts as found in the original books, or should we present the text in digitized text? Now, oftentimes digitized text is a lot clearer, and I can manipulate it and I can make it bigger. And what is found in what we call a tzurat hadaf, the printed version of whatever book we're talking about, may not be so clear. It may not be a digitized edition of that book, meaning printed with digital tools such that the lettering is clear. Instead, it might be quite blurry. Just think about the kind of evolution of books like the Mishnah Berurah. When I was young, they were really hard to read. Nowadays, they're crystal clear. And a lot of older books have gone through a kind of refresh by having been reprinted in ways that make them much more accessible. So is there a benefit in presenting texts as found in the books? Or is there a benefit in presenting text in the most clearest way possible? The short answer is that there are pros and cons to each position. There really are. And at times you may well agree with the former, and at times you may agree with the latter. And the short answer is, what are you trying to do in the shiur? If it is to present the most amount of text in the clearest way possible, which you can manipulate, well, undoubtedly you're going to try and use clear digitized text from various different databases or from the internet. But if it's to kind of highlight, to showcase the experience of encountering this teaching in the book where it is found, actually there's something deeply romantic about presenting it in the book that it's found, or from the image of the book that it's found. And truth is, I'm a romantic. I think certain ideas, as printed in a certain way, are read differently when encountered in that particular print. And it's not just about the words, it's about the context, about how the ideas were printed. And it's also about navigating the book to know where the ideas are found in the book. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about this issue, because more and more people are choosing the latter. In fact, they wouldn't even consider the former. But I think it comes at a tremendous cost, because if we don't teach people about the topography of a Shulchan Aruch, we simply copy and paste texts. When somebody actually opens the Shulchan Aruch, they don't know what to do. If we don't teach people the topography of a Gemara, or even a page of Mishnah or Mikor Gdolot, then they don't know what to do. Then when they go to Bet Midrash without a laptop computer or a handheld device, actually these books are alien to them. They're foreign to them. I think that would be a great shame. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question. Are you a romantic like I? Or are you kind of, if modernity enables this, let's go for it? And again, I think the answer depends on the kind of shiur you're giving.
I think if you're just giving a shiur online, a relatively short shiur or a course, it's vitally important not to exclude people, which will you be doing if you don't use digitized text. Digitized text makes it accessible for people that use screen readers. So now you have all people who are blind or severely sight impaired are included. A tremendous amount of people have, percentage of the population have sight impairment to one degree or another. I need to have text that's large print and clear, in a clear font that they can easily read. You'll be losing all of those people as well. And studies have shown that people with disabilities, or including sight impairment and blindness, are some of the people least likely to make their needs known or to complain because of fear of being ostracized. So it's very important to take their needs in mind for them in advance of setting up one shiur to make sure that your shiur is accessible to everyone. That being said, there are ways to teach formats of traditional text, like a page of Gemara, Shulchan Aruch, etc., any of the codes, and to do it in a way that is visually descriptive and will also reach people who are sight impaired and blind. You can do that with your with verbal descriptions of what's on the page. So I would say give a demonstration of how the format works. Show if that's what your shiur is focusing on, especially, but make sure you also give verbal descriptors of what you're doing so everyone can hear and understand and learn.
So I very much thank you so much. I very much take on board the notion of verbal descriptors, but I also want to add, I mentioned a couple of databases. One I haven't mentioned yet is Merkava. It's not quite so well known outside the world of education. But what they have is an interactive Tzurat Hadaf of the Gemara, which can be enlarged, actually, which also includes English, which is quite remarkable. Meaning there are certain websites where you can have the best of both of these worlds. Now, you can't have that for all texts, but you can have it for some. And,
exactly.
Right. And it's now the truth is most people know some of these sites, but they don't necessarily know all. And so as a result, they choose one over the other. And I don't think Merkava, by the way, are particularly good at self-advertising. And I'm not trying to criticize them, simply stating a fact. But what they did in terms of the framework and the format of the Gemara regarding accessibility is really worthy of admiration and celebration, and is a useful educational tool. And there are a few other websites that can do that or used to be able to do that. And so what I haven't done, and perhaps I will do as a follow-up of this course, is share a comprehensive list in terms of the unique products that certain websites have. Meaning, I'm not here to sell every digital website and every particular book, but there are certain websites that have unique things. I mentioned a couple last time where I said this particular source is found in this particular site, and that's really handy. And sometimes the only way you know that is because you know that. Just in terms of accessibility, I think I mentioned Mishnat Eretz Yisrael was recently added to Sfari, and it's a great book. It's also, by the way, we talk about accessibility. Another aspect of accessibility is cost. I can't afford the whole set of Mishnat Eretz Yisrael, although I actually knew one of the authors. But to have it accessible for free is amazing. I mentioned previously Nitai Gavriel. I can't really justify buying 30 volumes. To have it for free as a downloadable set of books or Torah Shalema is fantastic. So it's important to stress accessibility also refers to the economics of accessibility, although certainly those with various impairments need to be considered within any kind of learning setting. And this was just reminded to me just yesterday when I was giving a talk and we were talking about those harder of hearing. So Surat Hadaf, meaning classical format of text and digitized text, have pros and cons, and sometimes each comes at the cost of another thing. Presenting clear digitized text is better for more people in terms of clarity. However, that doesn't necessarily teach the skill of knowing, again, how to chart the topography of a particular book. And if that's what you want people to learn, then you do need to explain that and share that. And for those that may be challenging, one needs to explain that, as we mentioned, verbally, and give a variety of tools to encounter those texts in ways which they can be as best accessed as possible. Yoda, happy to hear from you. And if anybody else would like to let me know their thoughts on this topic, this is super, super important, just in terms of the experience of learning and the tools we're teaching through teaching in any kind of shiur setting. Please, yes.
So I facilitate a few sessions in Mesilas Yesharim, and I use digitized. It had become crucial because the online versions are based on different manuscripts.
Mm-hmm.
And so I will pull down open source text, and then I edit against the OFEC edition, and have made a lot of fixes to online texts. But that's become my standard, and this necessitates using digitized to make sure that my manuscript is accurate.
So this is a point I think I might have mentioned last time in terms of editions, but I didn't overstress it. And I think now is a good time to do that. There are academic versions of certain texts which are more accurate than general versions. Basically, a general version is a text that's been printed over many times and has been reprinted and hasn't necessarily necessitated much financial investment of the printer. And so you have the addition of the Yalkut Shimoni or the Midrash Rabbah, and it comes warts and all, meaning there are mistakes, there are errors in those texts. And then there are academic editions, which often cost more to produce and cost more to purchase, where the text is more accurate. The issue is that most of us don't necessarily have those works accessible to us. Now, some digital databases, especially those with text like Otzar Chochma, which is a paid database, may have more academic versions available. But for example, and here again, it's important for me to stress, I'm a big fan of this. But in many instances, the texts used in things like Sefaria are the easiest available texts. And thereby, sometimes the errors which existed in the classical text are there in the digitized text. And you may be giving a talk and quoting a commentary, and the commentary is referencing a text that's not there in what you've copied and pasted. And it is absolutely essential that you check. We're going to get to translation in a minute, but that you check that the actual text that you believe to be the one you're teaching is the one that you've copied and pasted. If you're using a clear digitized text, or even if you're using a Tzor Tadaf text, you may be using a certain version and not a critical edition, not one where the words have been verified with manuscripts or errors have been ironed out from the kind of printing errors that arise at Ta'ayot Sofer. This thing happens more often than we realize, and in the midst of a shir, you realize that the word you're focusing on isn't in the text that's on your handout. So always check the text that you're using in a handout with the focus of your shiur, or even not your focus of the shiur, but with the critical additions that you have, where possible, to make sure that what you're teaching is an accurate rendition of what you hope to be teaching. Any further thoughts on that point? Critical additions? Super important. Happens in the Rambam, happens in the Talmud, it happens in the Midrash, it happens in almost everywhere. We're
Sometimes they
affiliates
get.
you. Sorry, please.
Oh, sorry. I didn't interrupt. Please go
Please.
ahead. Oh,
That's okay.
I was going to say that sometimes it's helpful to include a difference between what you're focusing on and what the commentary is focusing on and the text, to intentionally include that as a teaching moment, and then bring up the other source so people can learn that this is a factor and how often this comes up and how important it is.
Most certainly. I mean, if that's within the capacity of the shiur, I would welcome it. It's not always in the capacity of the shiur, and often the shiur giver isn't aware, and it's not necessarily their fault. But we need to have on our radar the fact that most of the editions of text that we encounter are not critical editions, and that should force us to take a second look. That means perhaps going to a library, meaning simply because you can access that text somewhere doesn't necessarily mean that text is the most correct version of that text. It often is, if you can access it, it's probably the least correct version of that text, because that's how it was able to be used license free in whichever website you're using.
That's
Things
an
like
excellent.
Ala Torah use a little bit more careful and cautious in terms of critical editions, and they list which edition they're using. Sefaria, I think, sometimes does, and a number of other websites they show the kind of. But again, you need to know the topic itself to be able to kind of verify whether this is a good edition or a less good edition. One which is correct or not. And of course, when it comes then to translation, alachat kama v'kama. Translations which are available for free online, many of them are problematic. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be used, but it means buyer beware or user beware. Check the translations. Every translation is already a commentary. But even when it's being a commentary, that could be a sloppy commentary, a poor commentary, or at least a not helpful commentary to whatever you're going to do. By the way, this arose for me today, this morning. I write a thought every day on Daf Yomi. Okay? So for various reasons, I won't bore you now, I referenced a pasuk from Parshat Kitisa, where Moshe is told by God the following: "V'yomar Hashem and Moshe, psal lecha shnei lechot avanim karishonim," which is translated by most Chumash translators as "carve out 2 new tablets like the first." But guess what? Psal lecha does not say carve out; it means carve out for yourself. And the Midrash Tanchuma has a beautiful idea about what it means for Moshe to carve out for himself. You can't understand the Midrash Tanchuma on that pasuk if the translation of the pasuk omits the translation of the word lecha. Now that's just one random example that happened to me this morning. But oftentimes the translation omits a crucial detail which may well be core to what you're focusing on. So always check the Hebrew sources, most certainly check the translation of the Hebrew sources. Never assume that what you have in front of you doesn't need a certain measure of verification. Just before we get to actually what was going to be our final slide, but it's going to take some time to go through it. Any thoughts about things that have arisen? If you say, well, you're asking a lot of us, as I said at the beginning of the session, I say yes. Teaching is a serious business, and we have a responsibility to teach things correctly and to do our due diligence. And nowadays, when texts are available, sometimes it means that we're sloppy, and sloppiness can have consequences. And I say, if we are privileged enough to have easier access to texts, let's at least take care to make sure that those texts are correct. There's no errors that have crept in, which sometimes they do, and most certainly when it comes to translations. Okay, let's now get to our final slide, and what we're going to do is kind of give a midrash on these 13 points. Already we've mentioned probably another 12 more, which I haven't listed here. It's not because they're not important, but these are the ones I wanted to focus on. So these are some pro tips about making a source sheet. Number one, have a title. It almost doesn't matter what the title is. Some people like much more provocative titles. Some people like much more boring titles. I'm the kind of person who likes the title to actually reflect the focus of the shiur, so that it says, what it is in the tin. That if you're talking about Elul and self-belief, then call the shiur something like Elul and self-belief. Some people, again, use slightly more cryptic titles, which may well be interesting. But the question really is, when you use a cryptic title, will the person who went to the shiur remember what was meant by the title, a while later? I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no.
Again, you could do both. You often have a catchy title as your main title, and then you have the explanatory subtitle.
Right, again, of course. And if that's what somebody wishes to do, b'vakasha. Oftentimes, this is a question. There's a limitation of room, and nowadays, and this is something I should just mention because this is a practical issue that arises many times. When people like to advertise shiurim, so then which title are you going to use to advertise? The one which is catchy but doesn't necessarily mean much, or the one which actually says but may be more boring. And obviously, sometimes you have to market a shiur. The problem is that marketing a shiur and delivering a shiur are two different things. The field of marketing and the field of education are not the same. And too often, I feel that we focus too much on the marketing and too little on the education. I'm here speaking as somebody who has been involved in marketing Torah ideas, I suppose, but ultimately I'm a teacher. That's what I do. And I think education needs to be done with a solid measure of responsibility and making sure that the learners get a sense of what they're supposed to be learning or get a sense of what they're going to be receiving. Now, just on this point, this is just a practical one, and this happens to me the whole time. I'll give you an example from the shiur I gave today. 2 months ago, somebody said, we'd like you to give a shiur in El. I said, great. That would be fantastic. We agreed the time. They said, can you give me a title? Now, today is the 15th of September. That means it was the 15th of July. So in July, I'm needing to think about the title of the talk that I'm going to be giving in September. Now, admittedly, organizations have to market things, plan things. That's fine. But then you actually have to kind of prepare your shiur 2 months beforehand. But that's a bit problematic because I like my shiur to reflect what's going on in a moment. So you kind of have to throw a lasso around a certain group of ideas which resonates with you 2 months beforehand, which you hope will still resonate to you 2 months afterwards, and you hope will still resonate to the people on that day and that hour, given whatever might be happening in 2 months' time. So then you sometimes need to come up with a title which is meaningful enough to attract people, but vague enough to give you some wiggle room if you need to slightly change your focus. And this happens to me often and to many other people as well. So the title of your shiur has to be meaningful, but it has to be somewhat flexible. If you make it too limiting, then you're going to have to deliver exactly that, which is fine. But if you planned it 2 months ago and the world changed, you may actually choose to do something different, or you may not, for that matter. But that's something to bear in mind when you're asked to invited to give talks, more than a few days or weeks ahead of time. Have a title, number your sources. That's a no-brainer. To not number your sources is just to aggravate your listeners. To say the third source down the page, that's already to make your source sheet less accessible. And accessibility needs to, be part of your focus to all people, to all learners in all different many ways. Number 3, clearly title your sources. Now, you may be choosing to title them in their original Hebrew, if they're Hebrew sources, and they're English, and they're English sources. But if, for example, you're referencing a book, it would be good if you say the page name. So page number, apologies, because perhaps somebody wants to check it up. If you have that book, I'd like to know. So if it's, Sefer Chavetz Chaim Amud Nun Bet, then write that. Or if you're quoting an English book, then write the name, the author. You don't necessarily need to write all the other details. This isn't a bibliography, but enough detail that the participant who may have that source may wish to look it up. So details matter. An interesting issue that arose just with somebody I was helping with is they wanted to quote a book, but they were reading it on some kind of digitized reader. You know what I mean? Like a Kindle or something like that, where the page numbers are not the same page numbers. So they shared with me, they said, it's from this book. I said, what page? They said, I have no idea. I said, well, did you read the source? They said, yeah, I read it on a Kindle. I said, okay. So in that instance, you may not necessarily be able to tell me the page number, but where possible, give reference, because people are often very curious. They do want to follow up. Number 4, where possible, avoid explicit Shem Hashem, explicit reference of God's full name. This is part of this is in terms of the way in which one must treat these source sheets afterwards. If it's a source sheet with a whole verse or the name of God, then it needs to go to Gnizah or Shemot. If it's not, then still most people do that. But if, for example, these are copies which haven't been studied from, that's not necessary, and it simply needs to be gotten rid of in a respectable way. That means it could be put in the garbage in a plastic bag. So the differential will be whether you have explicit name of God or not. And so some people are quite concerned by that. And if you burden somebody with a handout with explicit name of God, then they're responsible to dispose of it appropriately. Sometimes they don't. And so if you're using digitized text, obviously you can manipulate that. If you're not using digitized text, you're not in position to do that. So I'll just pause here for a second. We've done points 1 through 4. Any thoughts about points 1 through 4? Okay, let's move on to point 5. Where possible, please.
You say here that clearly there's a number of your sources. What happens if you're not going to say it in the order that you're writing it down?
Even more so, because then you can say, I'm now looking at source number 4. The numbers do not necessarily talk about the chronology of your shiur, although certainly if you intend to be in a different order, then you might as well present it in the order you wish to present it. But imagine this often can occur where you go to a shiur. In fact, this happened to me a few weeks ago when I was giving a talk in Efrat. And I thought I was going to have 50 minutes for the shiur, and prayers ran late and something else happened. In the end, I had 35 minutes. So I knew I'd have to skip some things. Simply not possible to cover the amount of material I'd planned when you had 50 minutes left. So I had to summarize some things. I referenced the ideas, but I didn't read every source. And you have to be able to make those decisions in that moment. But by having the numbers, you're able to say, okay, we're not going to cover source 2. The basic idea is this. Please feel free to look at it. If there are any queries, let me know. We're going to now jump to source number 5. The point is that it enables me to direct the audience as to where we're looking now. Mm-hmm. The numbers are not so much that you must do it in that order, but it is to say, I shouldn't have to say, right, we're on the 4th line down with a word starting with the word ve'im. Once you have to do that, it makes it much more difficult, and it disturbs the flow of your delivery. Obviously, if you're using things like a PowerPoint and you're only doing one source per screen, that makes it a lot easier. But again, I mentioned, while there are many different ways of delivering content, here I'm focusing on, what shall we call it, the classic source sheet, because it is so ubiquitous. Still maybe ubiquitous, but we can improve it. Point number 5. Sorry. Did somebody say something?
I just said thank you.
Our pleasure. Point number 5, where possible, add some biographical detail. That means you can say, I may know who the Trumat Hadeshen is, but you may not, that may mean nothing to you. And even if I say his name is Rabbi Israel Isserlein, that still may not mean much more. And knowing where a person lives and when a person lives certainly is significant regarding the way in which their ideas may well impact the Torah conversation, or this particular conversation, if you're talking about the evolution of an idea or a concept. Now, that may not always be possible with the title of a source. So what I often do is, if I'm using a word, making a source sheet with word, I create a footnote. So if I'm quoting the Trumat Hadeshen, I put a 1, and at the bottom it says, Rabbi Yisrael Isserlein. I give the years when he's born and when he's died, and I say the country where he's from. Does that tell me his whole biography? Of course not. But a person then says, oh, okay, I have an idea. Is this a Rishon? Is this a Acharon? Is this Sephardi or Ashkenazi? And best as you can get from that information. It gives some kind of framework of understanding who this person is. Now, as the deliverer, as a teacher, you need to know much more about your sources than just their name, when they were born, they were died, and where they lived. You need to know who these people are. If you do not know that, then you will struggle to fully do justice to the ideas they're teaching, because you may well be completely unaware of the kind of influences which led this commentator to say what they did. That doesn't mean that every commentary is always a reflection of their historical context, but it is to say so many of them are that to be unaware of what their historical context is to, I say, do an injustice to the kind of ideas you're sharing. You need to know where people lived. You need to know ideally a little bit about them, their worldview. You need to know who these people are. These should be your friends. If you're quoting people, know the people, know who they are, have a sense of what they believed in. Because if you don't, you're likely to misinterpret them. And once you misinterpret them, you may that can be a grave error. But you're certainly doing an injustice to the Torah that you're quoting. Now, how much should you know? Ideally, as much as you can. Nevertheless, there are great books which give some kind of biographical information about biblical commentaries. There are great books to do that in terms of halachic commentaries, etc., etc. But nowadays, with the internet, in general, you can find out a little bit about most people. I would add further, that's not just limited to authors of books. This also includes scholars, Tanaim and Amoraim in the Mishnah and the Gemara. If you want to quote Rab Hanina, and you don't even know where Rab Hanina lived, and you don't know when Rab Hanina lived, you may not realize that there's something very deeply significant about what Rab Hanina is about to say. You have to have a sense of who the scholars you're quoting are. Because it could even be that the debate that you're quoting the Talmud never took place because one of the participants lived in one country in one generation and another lived in a different country in a different generation. And the whole debate is a fictionalized debate which the editor of the Talmud created. So these are really important things which emerges from being aware of some basic biographical details of the scholars you're quoting and of the personalities being referenced in the text that you're citing. Any thoughts about that point? I mean, all of these are important. Okay. Source 6, use a clear font. We've spoken before about accessibility. Obviously, use a clear font. I mean that in every dimension of the word, or use a framework, a platform which enables access to clear font. When in doubt, enlarge the font size. Meaning if you're saying, I could make it small, I could make it bigger, well, when in doubt, make it a bit bigger. Nobody's going to complain that I can see this so well, thank you. They're going to complain when they say, I can't see this so well. Be sensitive to people. Because if somebody's coming to your shiur, they want to participate. Just a quick aside, when you're copying not just digitized text, but when you're copying books, there are ways in which you can copy to maintain a higher quality image. And there are ways in which you can copy which reduce the quality of the image. Imagine you're looking at a tzurat hadaf of a particular page, and you copy and paste. You may find that the quality is reduced through that process. There are ways to maintain that. It depends on whichever program you're going from and to. But certainly that's something worthwhile bearing in mind. Meaning, even if it looks clear on your screen, when you print it, you may find it's a little bit more grainy, and that's not helpful. Always print a hard copy of a handout once and have a look at it before you print the 20 that you're going to do. Because you may find that things are less clear than you thought they were on your screen. Okay.
A couple of things about that. For the
Sure.
accessible font, if somebody isn't sure what an accessible font is, there are websites online that will give you names of fonts that are most accessible for people with sight impairment, learning disabilities, etc. Also, minimum point sizes, the point size of the font you're using. It's usually considered about 18 points is about the minimum to be considered accessible for a lot of people. You can go larger. Also, you can advertise beforehand. If people, to get in touch with you, people need different formats. And then you can send them to them specifically ahead of time so that they can be included. If that's can be done with advance notice, usually fairly easily. And what was the other one? Oh, can't think of it. Let's see. Point size. Oh, yes. Whoops! I dropped my phone. Sorry.
That's okay. Please go. We'll come back because our next point touches on something relevant, which is emboldened text is better than coloring texts, since some learners may be colorblind, and also because most source sheets are printed black and white. Meaning, Here's a blend of something which is considerate of some learners, even though others may well appreciate colored texts, words which are highlighted with different texts. But there's also pragmatic reality, which is most source sheets are printed in black and white photocopiers, for good or for bad, but that's simply the fact. So you can make something as beautiful as possible, but unless you're going to endeavor to print all of those with colored fonts, which may not be helpful because some people may not be able to see that it's red rather than yellow. So just obviously, it's different when it's on a screen to a certain measure, especially if you can point very clearly to what words you're focusing on. But being aware of what you may well appreciate to be dynamic and interesting and stimulating may actually be really annoying for some people who aren't able to tell the difference between the words in red and the words in blue, whatever. Number
Excellent.
9.
I remember what I was going to say. It was about, and I retrieved my phone. It's about mobile devices and enlarging the text size. On mobile apps, they don't often have the same features as on the desktop computers. And so you can't, on desktop computers, there's often a plus option and you can increase the font size yourself. This is frequently unavailable on mobile apps. People have to pinch out and hold it there, and they can only increase the size very slightly. So they made a position where they cannot increase the size of the text if you ask them to, just to be aware of that.
It's an important point, and obviously when a person is putting together, for example, a website, accessibility is important, but some are better than others, and different websites, Tanakh is better than, etc. One should know which different websites, if, for example, you're sending people to certain places, are more accessible than the next. Now, what I want to do now is a super important thing, which is relevant to the modern age, and we've got like a minute and a half left. Where a possible / appropriate viralized text. Now you may well say, well, I can't do that. Well, guess what? There are AI tools that can do that. Nakdan is a wonderful website which auto-viralizes text, either if it's a modern tech or a rabbinic tech or a poetic text. However, you have to check the viralization because it's still using artificial intelligence tools. And sometimes the phrase you're referring to has an unusual vowelization, which AI wouldn't have guessed because it's unusual. So if you choose to use things like Nakdan, which I encourage you to use and play around with, but also, again, due diligence, check things out. I mentioned before about translation, where possible, appropriate, add translation. Make sure it's aligned with your shiur. And then lastly, where possible, and this is something I always do, add your contact details, for example, your email, to your handout if attendees wish to follow up with questions. You don't have to have all your details, but if somebody has a query, it'd be nice if they know how to find you. So I don't want to overrun, which means we're going to have to stop now, but I hope this has been of some use, tangible, practical guidelines. I appreciate all the fantastic feedback and insights that have been offered by all of you as participants. I look forward to our 4th and final session next time. And I wish you happy learning and happy teaching. And I hope this has been of some use to you all. Take care, everybody. And Shavua Tov.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
So much. Sorry I took up so much of your time. I apologize.
It's all good. B'vakasha. Shavua Tov l'kulam. Bye, everybody. Bye, Justin. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.